not real emergency. It was an irregular heartbeat or something like that, and he had to go. So no, I woke up. I actually was dressed to leave the house and saw I had a message from the drummer's wife. She said, "Call Kim." So I called him, and when I went to my text message, I saw that I had a message from Dave. So I had to go in, change clothes, and it was right at time. So.
Oh, wow. Well, because, okay, yeah, it was Ken's wife, Janice, that has the cancer.
Yeah.
Okay, she's on our prayer list. And I met, she wanted to
Jamie.
Jamie,
Yeah.
it's Jamie.
Jamie.
I left my glasses, I thought of it twice.
This is interesting because that DSF study I'm in, we're just past this section.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so
I can't
I'm sitting there,
there's some overlap.
I'm sitting there going, how am I gonna do the whole life of, I mean, we could have spent 20 weeks on the life of David.
Well, this isn't about, it's the people of the promised land.
Ah, okay.
So it starts with going back to Noah and then, Abraham.
We'll give them
I'm just wondering about them, I would think they'd be here now.
well, they might have forgot to, that we moved,
Over here?
yeah.
But she was one that was questioning about the reception, there was a confusion about the reception, whether it was for everybody, and it wasn't.
Yeah, they went back and forth
Or
on that
with
one a
the
little bit.
email. Well, I went into the ask the preacher, because we had two funerals, whether or not we needed to do food, for either one, and there we go.
They catered it, it looked like.
Yeah, it was all catered, the whole thing was gonna be,
Hi, y'all.
hey, y'all, I did forget.
I saved you 2 places. Julia said no, not to worry, but I said no. I want to make sure you got a couple of spots too.
Thank you. Marty stayed with the.
Sure, she said that's all right. Let him sit out in the lobby. I said no, that ain't right.
We have our first one. Traditionals here, the choir. Okay, the other is the gibber, which is the band and all that kind of ritual.
Great music this morning, thank you.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
All right, y'all ready?
Yeah,
You got your track shoes on?
we need them.
Okay, so let me just tell you this, you have a very thick outline. And mostly because, let's just face it, there ain't no way we're getting any way through everything in David's life. It's just not gonna happen. So this one is definitely gonna be a flyby up here type thing, hit the high spots and try to make a point along the way. But what I did is I gave you basically 3 different handouts from mostly from Rose Publishing. One's on Solomon's Temple and how Solomon's Temple relates to Jesus. It's pretty cool.
Jesus and the
Yeah. Now, hopefully you can read it. You know how that goes when you try to copy these things. There's a beautiful little symmetry of Psalm 23 that I put in there. And then there is the life of David, which goes a little bit deeper into some of the key things in David's life. David is awesome. David is amazing. And the cool thing, I think the cool thing, and I'm gonna try to stay on topic, but the cool thing about David is if you look at him and Saul, David,
Polar opposites.
polar opposites, but David and his sins are way worse
Than Saul's.
than Saul. Okay? Now, Saul was disobedient to God and prideful. David, okay, adultery, murder. I mean, there's a laundry list of what David did, yet David is a man after God's own heart. So, it's going to be a very interesting study. I'm going to try to keep it high level. We are video heavy because I threw in a couple of videos just for the fun of it that will make some points. So just, where we are, we're still in the story of Israel. We will be in the story of Israel right up until Easter. and then after Easter, everything after Easter is the New Testament. But I think it's good to get the baseline of the Old Testament because a lot of times we just skip over it. So, with that, here's the kitty video.
One day, God told the prophet Samuel that it was time for a new king and sent him to the house of a man named Jesse. Jesse had 7 sons and brought out each of them to meet Samuel. Samuel told Jesse that David, his youngest son, would be the future king of Israel. Shortly after this, an army of the Philistines, Israel's enemy, set up camp on a hill right across the valley from Israel's army. For 40 days in a row, a gigantic Philistine warrior named Goliath would walk down to the valley and mock the Israelites. But one day, when David was visiting the army camp, he heard Goliath taunting the Israelites and asked why no one was willing to fight Goliath. After getting King Saul's permission, David went down into the valley and shouted to Goliath, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." Goliath and David charged toward one another. David pulled out a stone, put it in a sling, and flung it at the giant. The stone struck Goliath directly in the forehead, and then David killed him with Goliath's own sword. This victory caused David to become so loved and respected that King Saul became very jealous. Saul tried to kill David, but David escaped into the desert. One day, Saul was in a cave and David snuck up on him. But David could not bring himself to kill Saul. When Saul realized what had happened, he made a peace treaty with David, promising he would not kill him. But not long after, Saul became jealous and tried to kill David again. The Philistines attacked the Israelites and killed all 3 of Saul's sons. When Saul heard the news, he was so upset that he took out his own sword, fell on it, and killed himself. Then, David was named King of Israel. He made plans to build a giant building called a temple as a place to worship God. God said a temple would eventually be built, but by one of David's sons. One of David's descendants would become king, unlike any before, one whose rule would never end. One day, King David was walking around the roof of his palace and saw a woman bathing in her home. Her name was Bathsheba, the wife of a soldier named Uriah, who was off fighting in the war. David thought she was beautiful and sent his messengers to get her. They brought her to him, and David and Bathsheba slept with one another. Shortly after, Bathsheba sent word to David that she was pregnant with David's child. To hide what he had done, David quickly devised a plan. He called Uriah back from the war, hoping that he would sleep with Bathsheba, and it would look like he had gotten her pregnant. But when Uriah came home, he slept on a mat outside his house because he didn't want to disrespect his fellow soldiers still at war by living comfortably while he was at home. So David came up with another plan. He sent Uriah back to the battlefield and instructed the commander to put Uriah on the front lines of battle, where he was most likely to be killed. And that's exactly what happened. Shortly after, David married Bathsheba, and she gave birth to their son. But God was unhappy with David and sent Nathan to tell him a story. There were 2 men, one rich and one poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little lamb who was like a child to him. Now a guest comes to the home of the rich man, but instead of taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal, the rich man steals the poor man's one kills him. David was furious. "This man must die for what he has done," David said. Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man." David immediately realized how wrong he had been and confessed to Nathan and to God all of the things he had done. Even though God forgave David, there were still terrible consequences because of his actions. David and Bathsheba's infant son became sick and died. Then, years later, their second son, Absalom, did something no one, even David, expected. He gathered an army together to overthrow his father as king. Before the battle began, David gave instructions to his soldiers not to kill Absalom. But during the battle, Absalom was riding a mule under the thick branches of a large oak tree, and his hair got caught in the tree, leaving him hanging as the mule rode away. One of David's commanders, Joab, found Absalom, and despite David's instructions, he and his soldiers drove their spears through Absalom and killed him. Because of this, David was heartbroken. Even after these tragedies, David continued to worship God. He had not forgotten about God's promise to one day build the temple. So David told his son, Solomon, that he was to start building it. In his final days as king, David led the Israelites in worship of God for all of the ways that God had helped them and provided for them over the years. Then, shortly before his death, David handed over his kingship to Solomon.
Okay. So before I even go into this little thing here, y'all know the different stories, narratives of David. I mean, I think we grow up
Learning.
Learning.
Life in the giant.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Stories, you know.
Goliath, David and Goliath is probably one of the best known stories of the Bible. I mean,
People learn it when they're little.
most people know about Bathsheba. You know, what other stories have you lived with? I guess.
Well, correct me if I'm not wrong, but
Absalom.
wasn't that a little bit incorrect about Saul? Saul didn't kill himself. He fell on a sword, but the man found him alive, killed him, and David killed the man because he bragged about killing Saul.
Yeah, there's a couple of those things in there. Yes, David asked his sword bearer, Saul asked his sword bearer to kill him,
And he wouldn't do it,
wouldn't
right?
do it.
Right.
And then Saul fell on his sword. When he fell on his sword, did he die? You don't know. Did they still find him alive? Don't know. When the Philistine, I think it was a Philistine that came in and told David about that, basically he was boasting that I killed. Now, was he just boasting or did he really do it? Doesn't really matter because David had a respect for the position. Ooh, boy, could we learn something about that today?
It
Yeah.
says in verse, let me see, verse 4, the end of it. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. When his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead.
Was dead.
Okay, so he did see he was dead. I wasn't sure, I couldn't remember.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, because, yeah, good, thank you. That's good.
And so Absalom was Bathsheba's child, or was it another?
No,
person?
Absalom was
Yeah,
not,
I think so.
not from Bathsheba. We'll show that here in a little bit. You actually have a chart in this that gives David's line. It's hard to see, but it's on page 16, and I'll show that on the screen as we get there. So this you got to remember, 1st and 2nd Samuel are one book. They're one narrative, okay? And 1st and 2nd Samuel really it focuses in on these three folks. Now we talked about Hannah last week. We're going to bring her back up for just a little bit here in a little bit, but it's really a study in character of Saul and David. And yeah, they are complete opposites when you're looking at the upper story. Saul was prideful, basically he was incredibly flawed, but he was prideful and God wasn't important. Where David was just as flawed, if not more flawed, but was humble. And what you see is when Samuel came to Saul and rebuked him for not killing all of when he was like, whatever. I mean, really, in biblical terms, it's like, yeah, whatever. When Nathan comes to David and tells him that story about Bathsheba, he repents. In fact, not only does he repent, but we have the psalm that he wrote. It's almost like a relief, because, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit. But it's those two things. David is serving God, and we see that from the beginning. He has a heart to serve God.
And that I think is a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Saul, I'm just going to say his heart is not good.
Yes.
David's heart is good.
Yes.
And that's...
And it
The
shows
other-
how human we are.
Oh, yes.
The other question, though, that I think is, I don't know if it'll ever be answered in our lifetime, but Saul, it's been reported and believed that he was schizophrenic
Oh,
and had other mental.
there's no doubt that Saul is deeply troubled because when Saul, and we're going to see it here in a little bit because I'm going to show you a little clip from the Bible miniseries. Saul, when Samuel approaches him and says, "Hey, the kingdom is now going to be ripped from you," the Spirit of God left him, and an evil spirit from God sort of hounded him. Now, that evil spirit, I looked it up a lot more, and it is what it is. It is a evil spirit, from Jehovah or Yahweh. So, I mean, I'd like to skirt the issue and sit here and say, well, it's not really from God. No, I mean, the Bible says that God, in essence, tormented at points Saul, which gets to that schizophrenic point. I've been trying to wrap my mind around what that really means. And part of what I think it means is that when the Spirit of God and the power of God left Saul, that he knew it. Not like Samson, who didn't know it, because it happened with Samson just the same way. He knew it, and it almost feels like when you're reading it that this immense guilt came on Saul that he didn't know how to deal with. And I think schizophrenic is actually a really good term, that there were times where he just went nuts.
Well, I think there were times where he actually thought he was an equal to God.
Oh, yeah.
You mean Saul did?
Yes.
Which is certainly a sign of schizophrenia.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and
She thinks he's like Nebuchadnezzar.
I mean, that whole thing, but I think the power got to him too, though. Oh,
Well,
I'm going to be
that's-
king. It's like he didn't know how to deal with it.
that's all part and parcel, I think, of it. I think it all kind of culminates in that because here he's hiding in the luggage when he's anointed as
Yes.
king.
Yes.
Now he's everybody's basically bowing to him, and
Yeah, it was a big thing. It was like,
yeah.
wow, I got the power.
Yep.
The cool thing about David too, even with all of his sins, I don't think there's any reference to him ever repeating the same sin. He repents almost every time,
Yeah.
when he realizes he does wrong and he repents, but then he does something else. But it's like, he truly turns from it.
He repeatedly was didn't do well by his sons.
Oh, he was a horrible father.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, he did repeat a lot of his own
Oh,
sins over and over again, even though he repented, I agree with you on
Well,
that.
if you look at this chart, see how many sons he had. and it was
Well,
in all
how many
time.
wives
That's
he
another
had.
story.
So, yeah, so
Okay.
let me keep moving because we're gonna get to some of these things, which is really good. So, as we start this story, what we get is in chapter 16, Samuel comes into Bethlehem looking for, he doesn't even know who David is. He's looking for the next king. He knows he's supposed to go to the family of Jesse. He knows that Jesse has a lot of sons, but he doesn't know. All right? And the thing that I find striking, and I'm going to have to pick up the pace, but the thing that I find striking is when Samuel comes into Bethlehem, the people, the elders of the city, are scared of Samuel. They're like,
Yeah.
what do we do?
Yeah,
Okay?
they were, yeah.
So that whole thing, is very interesting from the standpoint of the people are still afraid of their leaders. All right? There's sort of a fear factor there. So Samuel finds, in short, Samuel finds David. David is the least likely from a king standpoint. Now, I think it's good to put it in perspective that...
Can you move to the left just?
All right. Put it into perspective that scholars think that he was between 10 and 15 years old when he was anointed. When we watch the video, we're going to hear Randy Frazee say that he's 16. Great. He is young, okay?
Yeah.
And he does not become king until he's 30. So
Guess
there
who else was the king at 30?
I know, another
What
parallel.
was that? What did she say?
Well, he wasn't king, but...
Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
he was
well,
our
he
king.
was king.
She said,
but-
guess who else was king at 30?
Okay, so David, there is a long period of time between David becoming... what?
Your brisket?
Okay, so this is meant to set up
What?
the video.
Well,
Okay?
this is what the sword bearer did to Saul.
This doesn't make any sense right now, but it's going to make sense.
Is it a burnt offering? Is that what it is?
This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story.
See the briskets?
Oh, there.
The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not look at what people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him cast in front of Samuel, but Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health, and he had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David.
I could hardly understand her, and I speak Wisconsin.
There's a famous, legendary story told of a marriage on the Hawaiian islands of Oahu many years ago. It was customary in that day to offer a dowry of cows to the father of your prospective bride. The standard price was 3 cows. Now, if the daughter was a special cat, she might fetch 4 cows. There was rumor that one father in a distant past received an unfathomable 5 cows for his amazingly gorgeous and charming daughter. Well, as legend goes, Sam Carew had 2 daughters. Now, his eldest daughter was not considered very beautiful by the islanders. The father determined years before that he would not likely fetch 3 cows for her. He dreamed of 2, but would settle for 1. As a matter of fact, if push came to shove, he would let her go for no cows at all to lighten the financial burden of taking care of her. Well, fortunately, his younger daughter was a definite 3-cow girl. One day, the richest man on the island, a man named Johnny Lingo, paid Sam Carew a visit. Everyone knew he was going to ask for one of his daughters in marriage. Everyone assumed it was for the younger daughter. But to the surprise of the whole town and to the dad's delight, he came a-calling for his eldest daughter. He thought to himself, I'm going to get 3 cows for her after all. Then he let his imagination get the best of him, and he thought he might receive the all-time offer of 5 cows. You can imagine the shock when the rich suitor brought 10 cows for his daughter. When they came back from a 2-year-long honeymoon, the villagers were struck by the difference in her presence. She was strikingly beautiful, graceful, poised, confident, and self-assured. Everyone thought Johnny got a bargain, paying only 10 cows for her hand in marriage. Johnny looked at Sam's oldest daughter from a different angle than her father and the other villagers. He looked beyond her outward appearance and saw the beauty of her heart and character. The moment he paid 10 cows, she became a 10-cow wife. And this is precisely what's going to happen to a young boy named David in chapter 11 of the story. Here's the setting. In the previous chapter, we learned that Israel wanted a king so that they could be like the other nations. They selected Saul, a man of standing, impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. A 5-cow king for sure. Unfortunately for the people of Israel, Saul didn't align his life and reign to the upper story of God. His disobedience sent a very contradictory message about the nature and character of the God of Israel. Instead of the surrounding nations seeing God as holy, just, loving, full of grace, through Saul's leadership, they saw him as cruel and greedy. And God communicated to the prophet Samuel that it was time to find another king, one who would represent God's heart and God's passion. On the direct order of God, Samuel was sent to the house of Jesse from Bethlehem, and one of Jesse's sons would become the next king of Israel. Samuel filled his horn with oil and left for what appeared to be a fairly straightforward assignment. When Samuel arrives, Jesse lines up his 7 sons from the oldest to the youngest. And Samuel goes through the lineup, but he doesn't anoint any of them as the next king of Israel. Samuel, perplexed, asks, are these all the sons you have? Unbelievably, Jesse admitted he had an 8th son named David, but didn't think to bring him off the field from tending the sheep because he couldn't see him as even a possibility. The Hebrew word Jesse uses to describe his youngest son is our English word runt. Like Sam Carew's daughter, David was the runt of the litter, a good boy, but would barely fetch a single cow. David came in from the field to meet the famous prophet. Before he knew it, oil poured down his head. God confirmed David would be the next king of Israel. Now at that time, David was a mere 16 years old. And there's a difference between being anointed as king and being inaugurated as king. David was the pick of God. but he would have to wait for a day in the future to actually become the king. However, we are told from the time that David was anointed with oil that the Lord was with him. And that's a big deal. With God working through young David, he finds himself saving Israel by taking out a 9-foot Philistine giant named Goliath. We find him joining Saul's army and being so effective as a warrior that the people begin to cheer David's success over Saul's. And Saul gets jealous, and he seeks to remove David, to actually kill him. And for the next 14 years, Saul tracks David down as a fugitive. David has many low moments in those 14 years where he wants to give up. But in the end, he grows, and he learns to trust in God. He records his deepest thoughts in his journal, which we call the Psalms today. Here are a couple of entries from his journal from that time. Let me read from the story. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? I am a worm and not a man, scorned by men and despised by people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. I can count all of my bones. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothes. Who would give even one cow for a worm? In the lower story, David felt like a failure. But this is not how God saw him from the upper story. From God's seat, he saw a different kind of David than his father, his brothers, King Saul, Goliath, and even David himself. When Samuel saw Jesse's older son, he thought he looked like a king on the outside. God interrupted Samuel with this comment of correction. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. David might have been considered a runt by his father on the outside, but God examined his heart on the inside and beheld a giant. You know, frequently a person puts on a show when they're in public to win the approval of people, or to portray an image not exactly accurate of who they really are. God, however, peers our actions when no one else is looking. When David was out all alone in the hills, shepherding his dad's small flock of smelly sheep, God observed him from above. What God viewed day after day caused him to select this young man as the next king of Israel. The integrity in David's heart manifested itself when no one was looking, and it caught God's attention. Listen to Psalm 78. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheep pens. From tending the sheep, he brought him to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with skillful hands he led them. You see, Israel needed a king who had a heart overflowing with integrity. This kind of king would reflect the nature and character of God and cause not only the Israelites, but the surrounding nations to want to follow this God. So if David is God's number one pick, why did he allow King Saul to stay in office and chase David around the world for 14 years? The answer is simple, and the same one we found in Joseph's story. To grow David up so he could handle the pressures of shepherding an entire nation. You see, it's one thing to shepherd a small flock of sheep. It's another level altogether to shepherd a nation. Essentially, God put David through the spiritual boot camp to chisel him and to refine him into the kind of man who would truly trust in God. Now, it's interesting to note that on several occasions, Saul had a change of heart and wanted to make peace with David. However, God didn't allow it. We're told it was God who hardened Saul's heart toward David. And at some point in Saul's reign, his continual pattern of disobedience crossed the line. And God looked into his heart the same way he did with David's, and he saw a lack of integrity. Saul's new mission in life became to leverage his jealousy and his lack of integrity to equip David to handle disappointment and to trust in God. Let this be a reminder to us that God can use our disobedient lives as effectively as he uses our obedient lives in the lower story to work out his upper story plan. However, we will miss out on the rich blessing that comes to those who follow God's will. 14 years later, David became the king of Israel, and a good king he was. Later in the story, we're given this assessment of David's reign. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and had not failed to keep any of the Lord's commands all the days of his life. A number of years ago, a Christian artist sang a song about David that went like this: when others see a shepherd boy, God may see a king. Well, here's another way to say it. When others see a one-cow boy in the lower story, God may see a 10-cow king from the upper story. But there's more. There's more going on in David's story that points us to God's upper story plan to get us there. David was referred to as God's anointed one. Those two words in our English language, is the Hebrew word Messiah. David was the Messiah in the lower story. His righteous reign pointed us to the Messiah in the upper story. God's looking for more Davids today. People that the world may consider to only fetch one cow. But God sees a 10-cow potential in them. That canon should be said of us as we seek to align our lives to God's upper story plan. We too, like David, can point people toward the one true Messiah.
These two videos are probably two of the better ones, I gotta tell you. So you have your outline, all right? And I put it up there, and this does not, in any means, hit all of the highlights, or all of David's lights. It just hits the highlights of it. And we gotta remember again that this book of Samuel, this story of Samuel, of Saul, and of David is one big book. So I want to remind us of where we were last week, which was Hannah's prayer, her song, which was back in the beginning, second chapter of 1 Samuel. And God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. And despite human evil, God is at work. And God will raise up a king, a messianic king. So everything that we see God doing here, the people wanted a king. He gave them Saul. That didn't work out. All right? Because Saul was utterly messed up from the standpoint of being with God. So then he gives him David. And David has already, that line of David through Judah has already been planned out. All right? Rahab the prostitute. All right? Ruth. So you see this line going to Jesse, and now we get David. So let's go back a little bit and review a little bit from last week. This video is from the Bible. Okay, so the mini-series, the Bible. When we went through into the story with the men's group, I showed this video, and I love this video because it does two things. One is it sets the fall of Saul and the rise of Daniel. All right, and then the other thing it does is, you get David and God. So sit back and watch. This is sort of cool. And by the way, it's totally inactive.
Samuel, you should be here. We must make a sacrifice before we attack. We cannot wait any longer.
Your sacrifice was mine.
instruct you. Kill everyone and everything.
A new era in Israelite history is beginning. The period of prophets and kings. They must work together to secure the promised land.
Listen carefully to Saul.
You have one task, one simple command from God. Destroy Israel. We followed his commands. Then what is this beating of goats in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle and wheeling of lambs? Can the dead cry out? No! Is it pagan killing? He is to be put to death later. When the Lord says spare, you spare. When he says kill, Samuel! You are correct. But I am your king. What the Lord gives, you can take away. These God's words are yours. Your descendants could have ruled for over 1,000 years. Today, God has forsaken you. More than my words. God has torn your power from you. He wants a man after his own heart. Bring me wine, son. You hear me? Now! Yes, sir. As the next day, I should ask God's forgiveness. Bring Samuel to me. He's gone, Majesty. Gone? Samuel!
After Saul's disobedience, God commands his prophet Samuel to find a new king.
Young man! What is your name?
David, sir! My name is David.
appointed time, David becomes an attendant in Saul's court, a king in waiting. The Philistine threat continues to grow. Now we have a new champion. Goliath.
Will one of you fight me? Israelites, you win. And the Philistines will be your slaves. I win. And you will be our slaves. Someone must fight him. You, Jonathan. The warrior who defeats him will be a rich man. Not one man in Israel. Not one of God's people.
I'll do it.
You're no soldier, you're a shepherd.
Yes, shepherd. So I protect my sheep, God will protect me.
Where is your faith? Where is your God?
I will kill him.
Don't need this.
I'll be better without it. Here I walk in the valley of the shadow of death. Fear no evil. You are with me. I run the star. They comfort me. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life.
Israel's got a champion. Don't waste my time, little boy. You're too young to die.
I will fight you!
so many inaccuracies.
Yeah, it
But
can
what I wanted, go ahead.
Question is the Philistines, they keep fighting them and fighting them and fighting. So I'm looking on the map here, to see where it is. So it's on the border of the Mediterranean, but who were they?
Philistines?
Yeah.
Oh,
Do
Lord.
we know? Because
Yeah,
they
we
keep
know.
reoccurring and reoccur, you know
Yeah,
what I'm saying?
I mean, they were,
See, it's right
they
there.
were there, they're part of the I don't know
Were
the.
they already occupied there before Israel?
Oh, yeah,
did?
yeah, they were part of the people that hadn't been
Maybe.
thrown out, you know, driven out. So,
Uh,
so let's,
So,
go ahead.
just in general,
Wow.
not that I ever object to anything that you're doing,
Yeah.
but what are we supposed to take away from a totally inaccurate film clip?
Well, okay, what I want you to get out of that is how it all started and how brutal it was.
Okay.
And how I think the one thing that's neat about this is it portrayed Saul to me. You saw that sort of crazy.
Crazy looking.
You know, that craziness of it. There's so many historical, biblical inaccuracies in how they filmed it, but that's okay. The idea is it was brutal. It was constant war with Saul, and Saul slowly and surely was going insane. All right, and that's sort of what you get out of it. And David started out humble, of nothing, of no means. In fact, you know, when he won this battle, all right, when he beat Goliath, part of the reward was to be given one of Saul's daughters. All right, and it took a while, but he was supposed to be given one of his daughters, and then all of a sudden Saul didn't give him the daughter. And then another one of the daughters loved him, so Saul's like, great, you want my daughter, go and kill and give me 100 Philistine foreskins. Okay, that's close. You understand what that is? Okay? All right? That's not long distance killing. You got to get pretty close. And what does David do? So David is this humble shepherd who is a very, very passionate man. He's a poet. He's a musician. He is a warrior. And he is a warrior to the nth degree, to the point that God won't allow him to build his house because of how much blood he shed. Okay? So this is the relationship that you've got going. Now, there's this wonderful inconsistency where David is anointed, the spirit of Saul leaves him, and they call for a musician because Saul's court sits there and says, you got an evil spirit amongst you. Let me bring you a musician in. All right. So they pull David in as a musician. All right, and he is coming in and basically soothing via the harp Saul. But then we get to David and Goliath, and Saul doesn't know who David is. How can that be? Well, you know what? I think this little scene that you saw there sort of can explain it. Saul probably didn't know who David is. In fact, when you get this relationship with David that's going on, if you read it closely, Saul and David in a lot of instances don't talk to each other. It's through intermediaries. You know, Saul sent someone to tell David this. All right, so to me, this idea of it being a problem isn't really a problem. You know, Saul could have no idea of David being in his court while he's a little musician before David and Goliath. So David's there. David, even before Goliath, knows that he's going to be king. He's already been anointed king. He's coming to give food to his brothers. And then all of that happens. Well, as soon as David kills Goliath, he is brought in and no longer allowed to go home. Saul brings him into his court, and now he stays there. And he becomes a warrior. He becomes a general. He gets married. And Saul slowly and slowly is trying to kill him. He's trying to kill him directly through, every once in a while, throwing a spear at his head, all right, as he's playing the music. Indirectly by saying, oh, you want to marry my daughter, go and kill 100 Philistines and bring me their foreskins. And all of this is happening, and Jonathan, Saul's son, the next in line to be king, is now knit. It says it in the NASB that their souls were knitted together. This relationship between Jonathan and David is amazing, to the point that Jonathan gives David his armor, all right, which is basically submitting to David that you will be the next king. He knows that. How he knows that, the Bible doesn't really tell us that. But Jonathan knows that, and Jonathan repeatedly steps in between Saul and David to save David's life. He's like a spy in the castle, you know what I mean? He does this over and over again. This relationship between David and Jonathan is amazing. All right?
It's sort of like we would think, and that's not, we're not talking on a sexual term, on sexual, and now when we're talking soulmates, as in soul brothers, that nothing can really tear them apart.
I've not been in the military, but I've been on deployments when we go into disasters. And even on that level, the people that you serve with, you get so close to.
You have to, because you each depend on each other.
Jonathan and David are warriors together. But the one thing that about Saul that I thought helped to drive him a little bit off his rocker was he had this perception that he was actually trying to save the kingdom for Jonathan.
Yes.
And couldn't understand why Jonathan
wasn't.
And so when David was anointed, I don't know if that was done as a secret.
It was in public.
Right, so everyone would have known he was the next anointed king.
That's true. Yeah, I would definitely buy that word would have gotten to.
Would have had to, I would think.
Yeah.
You know, and so that probably just fueled Saul's what do you call that?
Anger, whatever.
Well, his feelings of needing to fight for his family, or
well, and Saul still thinks he is doing the will of God by basically fighting the Philistines. He's going through these battles to get the land, so he thinks he's still following God.
Well, except that he says when Samuel confronts him, he says, "I've sinned against your
God."
Your God.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not sure that he was so eager to follow God as much as build his own reputation and his own fiefdom.
Yep. And that haunts him. And so, David becomes this warrior, and there is, in essence, a point in time where the war that we read about in the Bible is not Saul or the Israelites against the Philistines. It's Saul chasing David.
Yeah.
And now you have to put yourself, because this is a decade-long battle at this point of Saul chasing David. Now David has this ragtag band of brothers that are with him. And if you go through the scriptures and you read about some of these mighty men, you don't know all of them, but you know some of them. These are like outcasts, all right? And these outcasts that come with David stay with him throughout the entire time and become the foundation of the leadership with David. All right, it's very interesting. I'm going to throw that little grenade and walk away from it. But there's two books that I brought in. If you want to go deeper into David, which is a very good thing, Chuck Swindoll's book on David is outstanding.
What is it called? Book on David?
It's called A Man of Passion and Destiny, David. And that's by Chuck Swindoll. Another one, it's a little bit different read, is called Leap Over a Wall by Eugene Peterson.
The guy who wrote the Message.
The guy that did the Message. And it basically goes through, and you can pass it around, it basically goes through some very interesting things with David in his life. So I recommend those two if you're wanting to go a little bit deeper. So to keep going, put yourself in David's place. You have been anointed king. You have served as a general, basically, for Saul. And now Saul has completely rejected you, is chasing you. You are hiding in caves. You are acting like an insane person in Gaul, which is where Goliath came from. You are now living with the Philistines.
Yeah.
All right? I mean, how dark and how isolated did David get? All right? And you read some of that in the Psalms. You hear that in the Psalms. Psalm 22, which is a messianic psalm, which he talked about, read a little bit there. That is one that is definitely David on the run, but it's also one of Jesus' view from the cross. Definitely need to read that. It's awesome. So to keep going on to the story, we finally get to a tragic end where, and we were talking about it at the beginning a little bit, Saul, Jonathan, and some other sons of Saul are finally beaten down and killed. It's horrible. Their bodies are taken and basically, hung on the temple of Ashtaroth, I believe it is.
Yeah.
And some of the men from one of the towns go and grab their bodies, burn them. It's terrible.
Yeah, they burn them. I thought that was interesting. So bury them.
Yeah. So David then becomes king. But he doesn't become king of the whole empire, all 12 tribes. He only becomes king of
Judah.
Yeah.
Judah and Benjamin, right?
And it takes 7 years until all of the tribes, the unified kingdom comes together. And during this time, David is doing some crazy things. He wants the ark, which has been not where it's supposed to be, I guess you could say, to come to Jerusalem. And so he brings the ark down. Now, first he tries to bring it down and it messes up because he just brings it down, doesn't do it the right way, and we have some folks that are burned up and died.
That was an interesting question I had about that, because Uzzah is the one that tries to keep it from falling over and dies.
Yes.
How do they get it out there on the new cart?
Well, So the way it's supposed to be carried.
They carried it out of wherever it was at
Supposed to be on.
someone.
Yeah, those people wanted it out of there.
No, they were being blessed.
Yeah, no, the people that had, after the Philistines
Oh,
sent
okay.
the ark back, the folks that were keeping the ark, which were the Levites,
Okay.
were
Okay.
keeping.
Oh, they were Levites?
They were Levites.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they were keeping.
That's how they moved it then, because they could touch it.
They could touch it. Well, what happened was, it was never supposed to be put on a cart. It was supposed to be put with the wood.
Carried.
The
Well,
carried.
And not a new card on
Yeah.
top of it, but it was Nito something, or
Yeah.
Neod was the guy's name.
Yeah, and not to go, I'm staying up high because there, basically what happened was, one of the priests, he was a Levite priest, all right? The cart was messing up, was tipping, and the ark was there, and he touched the ark, which he's never supposed to do.
He was a priest?
He was a priest. He was a Levite priest. Yeah.
Okay.
And basically, David didn't have the instructions of how that cart or that ark and the temple, the tabernacle itself was supposed to go. It was very regimented from God back in the days of Moses.
And yet the Philistines were able to take it to where they wanted to go, and not a one of them at that moment. Once they touched it, they did not.
But they
got
did
his
not
wrath.
after. I'm saying they did not. And that doesn't go with the rest of what.
Well, and if you read that account, what happens is David gets mad. Because again, he's sitting there thinking, I'm doing this for God. And then, they don't tell you this, but reading between the lines, in essence, he finds out by reading the Torah, the instructions, because now when he does it the second time, he's doing it correctly. He's doing it correctly. And the thing is, he is absolutely unashamed. This picture is an awesome picture. He's dancing.
I wonder if Samuel's not dead.
He is dancing to bring this ark into Jerusalem. To the point,
Right, did his wife think, oh, she lives in there?
which is Saul's wife,
That's
Saul's daughter, Micah,
Micah leaves him.
said, well, she
is
sits
embarrassed, right?
Well, she sits there and goes, oh, look at the king. You're so kingly dancing in front of it. Well, the interesting thing is she has no kids.
No kids, exactly.
She is barren. Now, is she barren? Or is she ignored?
She had no kids before this?
No.
Right, and then
Ignored.
it was interesting, and then
Yeah.
she's, I don't understand.
So,
question real quick, where's Samuel? Is he dead by now?
Samuel died.
I thought
That's
so.
why he didn't know.
Samuel,
Oh, Samuel.
not Saul.
You know
Why
what?
didn't he
That's
tell
a,
him about
That's a
the
good
thing?
question.
that is a great question.
He was, I think.
And I don't know when Samuel died.
Well, it was a very small sentence that
Was it?
began one of the chapters that, I think that said that Samuel had passed
Nathan was the
away.
equivalent then. Nathan
Yes.
came on.
Nathan sort of took his place as far as a prophet for
You're
the
gonna make me
king.
look.
I don't know when Samuel died.
First Samuel 25, it says verse 1, then Samuel died.
Okay, there you go.
Go ahead.
So, David is doing his thing, and we get in the middle of this story, 2 Samuel chapter 7, where David now has this passion to build God a house. He wants to build God a house, and God's not going to let him do it. Okay, but it's his passion. And it's sitting there in the middle of this story, just sitting there. Boom. But we're going to talk about that at the end, because what God tells David is totally messianic in nature.
Yeah.
It's all about Jesus at that point. So, David's going along great. He's, a man after God's own heart. And then. So, let's watch the and then part of it. Which, basically, the thing I love about the thing I love about this part of it, obviously David makes a ton of mistakes. He has adultery with someone else's wife. He tries to cover it up, and then he plots basically to murder Uriah. Okay, the penalty for adultery and for murder is death, to be stoned. Okay, and so we'll get to the story, but Nathan says when he rebukes him that you're not going to die. But there are consequences. And I think it's a lesson for us today in grace. Mm-hmm. We all are sinners.
Amen.
But God, but God, through Jesus, gives us grace to, in essence, avoid the penalty of death. For the wages of sin are death. However, one of the things that's not necessarily popular to preach today is even though you are forgiven of your sins and your sins are washed away, there are still consequences. Consequences directly to you and to others around you. And that's sort of the point of this with David and Bathsheba, is you could tell when Nathan came to him and said, he told the story and said, "You are the man," there was a relief. Because if you read Psalm 51, I believe, it's a relief psalm. You know what I mean? Yeah. And there was a relief that hidden sin was let go. Now, I'm sort of jumping ahead, but because we'll watch the video here in a second, but scholars think, and it's not said in the Bible, that after the sin with Bathsheba, killed Uriah, and then they became man and wife. All right? Now, most people can understand what 9 months is. All right? But scholars believe that from that point that they got married until when Nathan came was a full 12 months. So David is living with this guilt for about a year. And it's eating.
So where are we at scripturally with this clip that you're giving us?
This is gonna basically start 2 Samuel 11.
Okay.
This is the chapter 12 video.
Okay. This is your story. This is my story. But most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion. Blot out my transgressions, wash joy and gladness. Let the bones of earth rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me.
Once there was a little boy who lived in the country. For facilities, they had to use an outhouse, and the little boy hated it because it was hot in the summer, cold in the winter, and stunk all the time. The outhouse was sitting on the bank of a creek, and the little boy determined that one day he would push that outhouse into the water. Well, one day after the spring rain, the creek was swollen, so the little boy decided that today was the day to push the outhouse into the creek. So he got a large stick and he pushed. Finally, the outhouse toppled into the creek and floated away. That night, his dad told him that they were going to the woodshed after supper. Knowing that meant spanking, the little boy asked why. Well, the dad replied, "Someone pushed the outhouse into the creek today. It was you, wasn't it, son?" The boy answered yes. But then he thought a moment and said, "Dad, I read in school today that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and didn't get into trouble because he told the truth." The dad replied, "Well, son, George Washington's father wasn't in that cherry tree." We can all identify with this story in at least 3 ways. First, there's something inside of us that compels us to do wrong. The Bible calls it the sin nature. Second, our lack of goodness affects other people, not just us. Some of you have been in a lot of those outhouses that have been pushed over by sinful people. And number 3, there are always consequences associated with our actions. Well, this is the subject of chapter 12 of the story. David is still king of Israel, and everything is going great. He is advancing the understory plan of God beautifully. Israel is being super blessed for it. If you're in the business world, you'll understand the phrase, everything is up and to the right. For example, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1 states that he is living in his palace in rest from his enemies. In 7:18, he says, "Who am I, O sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? Is this your usual way of dealing with man, O sovereign Lord?" In chapter 8, he's winning battles. Chapter 8, verse 15 tells us David reigned over all Israel, doing what was right and just for all his people. David was a good king. In chapter 9, David is fulfilling his promises in the touching story of Mephibosheth. And in chapter 10, he's still winning even more battles. But it is often when we are doing our best and things are working for us that we are the most susceptible to a fall. We let our guard down. 2 Samuel 11 represents a huge pivotal shift in David's life. On the heels of all of his success, David falls into an adulterous relationship with a gal named Bathsheba. And Bathsheba gets pregnant. To make matters worse, David tries to cover it up by bringing her husband Uriah off the battlefield to be with her so Uriah can get credit for being the father. David tells Uriah to go home and spend the night with Bathsheba, but Uriah refuses to be with his wife while the other men are at battle. Let's listen in on the conversation. When David was told Uriah did not go home, he asked him, "Haven't you just got home from a distance? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my master Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open fields. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." It's not the right thing to do. Uriah's integrity is unknowingly being put up against David's integrity, and it exposes the contrast. It should have caused David to stop in his tracks and change courses. But David decides to dig himself deeper. He sends Uriah back into the battle. He sends a letter to the commander of his army, and we get to see what he writes. Put Uriah on the front line, where the fighting is the fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die. And that's exactly what happened. He died in battle that day in service to his king, who stole his wife. The story unfolds. David marries Bathsheba, and she's about to give birth to the child. Everything has been covered up, and all is back to normal, right? It wasn't the right thing to do, but it appears that he has gotten away with it. Wrong. God loves David too much. We discover that David has a special friend who approaches him. His name is Nathan. He is a prophet who hears from God and whom David trusted to lead him to God's way. Nathan earned the right to be heard, and that's very important. David is in his office busy about the affairs of being a king when Nathan enters. Nathan confronts David with his sins. David's scandal is exposed. Now fast forward through the rest of the Old Testament and even into the New Testament. What you will find is that David is still revered, unlike Saul. In the Hall of Faith chapter in Hebrews chapter 11, David is listed, but not Saul. Now the question becomes, why? It isn't like David's sins are less hideous than Saul's. Saul didn't wait for Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice and did not completely wipe out the Amalekites. But David committed adultery and even murder. I think it is in their response to God when confronted. When Saul was confronted by Samuel, he rationalized and made excuses. When David is confronted by Nathan, he responds, I have sinned. You already have heard the prayer of confession he wrote in his journal. It is found in Psalm 51. Saul rationalized his sin, but David admits it and comes completely clean with God. And therein lies the difference. But there's more. David lived with the consequences of his sin with dignity. And Saul never accepted what he did. Just because we admit that we have done the wrong thing and even make it right doesn't mean the consequences will go away. After David's adultery and murder, his personal life and kingdom go downhill. For example, 2 Samuel 12, the baby dies. Chapter 13, his daughter is raped. In chapter 15, his son rebels and tries to take his throne. In chapter 18, that son dies. In chapter 20, there is another major rebellion against him. Sometimes when we do wrong, we set unstoppable consequences in motion. David faced those consequences with dignity. There were grave consequences for David's actions, but because he did the right thing, his relationships were restored. Most importantly, his relationship with God. And at the end of his life, I want you to notice that even though so many things went south for him, in the second half of his journey, he was still very much in love with God. Chapter 12 records one of David's last prayers in front of all the people. At the end of David's life, he is still loving God with his whole heart, worshiping God with his whole heart, and still pointing people to God. What's the difference between Saul and David? They were both sinners, just like we are. The difference is in their response. Our role in life, in this life, is to point people to God by the way we live our lives, the priorities we have, the way we treat other people, and what we say to them. This is how we align our lives to the upper story. It also includes how we handle sin in our own life. David's response revealed the character of God. God is holy and just, but God is also gracious and loving. He restored David's relationship with him. But not only that, God blessed David and Bathsheba with more children. And as you know, David had more than one wife. We won't get into that right now. Which son would succeed David on the throne? You guessed it. it would be a son born from the womb of Bathsheba, a son named Solomon, which means that Bathsheba is included in the lineage of Jesus Christ. We see this over and over again in the story. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and now Bathsheba. This pattern alerts us to God's grace and desire to include the least likely candidates in the unfolding of his upper story. The same is true for us. God wants us to walk in righteousness and truth so others can see God through us. He also wants us to be like Uriah, who does the right thing and lives with integrity. He wants us to be like Nathan and have the courage to confront a friend who's gone down the wrong path. But he also wants us to be like David. When we do sin, when we do wrong, when we hurt others, how we respond can also show God to others. That God is gracious and forgiving and will restore us if we come to him with a pure heart like David did. Pushed over any proverbial outhouses lately? Now you and I know exactly what we need to do.
It's so funny.
I'm telling you, these two videos are awesome.
It's so funny.
Oh yeah, well I mean that story. So he has a book called The Heart of the Story that sort of expands these videos a little bit, and that's a West Texas story, by the way. So,
Oh, is it? I wonder.
so I'm gonna fly through some of this because I want to get to the end on time. But Bathsheba,
What's the book? The Heart of the what?
The Heart of the Story.
Okay.
So you got Bathsheba. Can you imagine Uriah handing the note to get killed?
They get killed, yeah.
I mean, and here's the thing. David knew his integrity because he knew he wasn't going to open the door. You preach a whole story on that. Nathan, you want to talk about a brave man? To walk up to the king who could basically have you killed and say, you're the man. And then Bathsheba, with their first son, that's terrible. Now, here's the lineage. And this is on your sheet. Hopefully you can read it. But I want you to take a couple of things. He's got a lot of wives. And he's got concubines and other wives. These are the wives that we have names for. Now, what happened here is you got over here Arnon, I think is his name, and you got Tamar.
Amnon.
And yeah. This guy raped his half-sister.
Yeah, I just read that again.
Absalom is Tamar's
Brother.
sister. Absalom's Tamar's sister from this mother. Okay? He gets so mad that he kills his half-brother. Now here's the thing. Why we say that David is a terrible father? He knew that Tamar was raped by his son and didn't do anything
about it.
All right? So, that's a whole other story. Bathsheba, I want you to notice two things. You see the bold type? Bathsheba not only has King Solomon, but Nathan. Both lines of Jesus go through Bathsheba. Joseph and Mary. By two different sons of Bathsheba.
So Joseph is from Nathan?
I can't remember which one's from Nathan and which one's from Solomon, but Mary's from one and Joseph's from the other. So not only do you have Bathsheba having King Solomon, but both lines, Joseph and Mary, come through sons of Bathsheba. Absolutely.
And David?
Yes.
No,
I mean,
that
well,
was
yes.
the prophet
Yeah.
name.
Absolutely amazing. What happened to Absalom? Now, he revolted and all that. That's what happened to Absalom. There's his tomb to this day. Crushed it. Crushed it. Because he wanted Absalom to be the king, not Solomon.
Who did?
David.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So,
What I know when he died, it tells the story.
Yeah.
He died and it crushes him. Absalom first.
So, David hands over the building of the temple to Solomon. Solomon is anointed king. And David spends the latter part of his life gathering all of the material. And you can read that list of material so that Solomon could build the temple. And we get the temple. And we think of Solomon's temple and David's temple being the big, huge, wonderful thing. And it was. It was ornate beyond belief. But when they came back from captivity and they rebuilt the temple, when they first rebuilt it, it wasn't so good. But when Herod did his part, this is the size difference between Solomon's temple and Herod's temple that Jesus would have seen.
But wasn't the temple still smaller than Solomon's palace?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Solomon's palace is, yeah. And you want to talk about even more opulent, you look at Herod. So, what you have this on your thing, on your outline, and that's the big long thing. But 2 Samuel chapter 7 is key, because this is where David wants to build the temple, and he gets the word back from God that no, you're not building it. It is pointing towards Jesus. There's going to be, I'm going to build you a temple, but it's going to be a future temple, eternal kingdom. And you're going to get a Messiah, and I'm going to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant. Read chapter 7 and 2 Samuel chapter 7. So what can we take away from all of this? Very quickly, when times are tough, God is really our only security.
Well, even not just tough times, but just all
Anytime.
the time. If we trust Him as that all the time, then when rough times come, we're prepared.
Oh,
A
yeah.
little more prepared.
When our days are dark, the Lord is our light. When our walk is weak, the Lord is our strength. And then when the future is foggy or fuzzy, the Lord is our only hope. That's the story of David. David leads to Jesus. And all of this story, all of that we've gone through, is basically foreshadowing of Jesus' first coming and Jesus' ultimate second coming, where all of this is going to be fixed.
Can you move to the left or
Would you move to the left?
Thank you.
So there you go. We got through it almost on time.
Wow.
There's a lot.
I got to tell you, this was hard to try to narrow it down because there's so much. There's so much richness. I highly recommend Swindoll's book is outstanding because he'll go through at the end and tell you, when David flees from Absalom, the help that he got and who those people were. I mean, there's little bits and pieces like that throughout. I mean, we could spend a whole lot of time on David. So next week is Solomon.
Go back one second.
Edit all.
It's on your outline.
Next week is what?
Next week is King Solomon.
Oh.
It is one of your best.
Yes. Right there.
Okay, funny. Yeah, that's funny.
All right.
Thank you.
Another book that I recommend for you as we're running out of here tonight. Rick Warren did a series of about 10, 11, 12 messages on Psalm 23. All right? He has this little workbook called Living in the Goodness of God. And you just go to Daily, or Pastor Rick, or whatever his website is, and you can look that up. And what I did, I didn't go over, there's no way, I knew I wasn't going to get to it, but if you look at the shepherd and you look at the Psalm 30 or 23, he goes through the promises that are in Psalm 23. They in the video showed that as being, early in David's life. I think Psalm 23, which is probably the most famous one, that's the end. That's the epitaph of David's life. He could say at the end, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He knows it because he's walked it by them. So, highly recommend this. It's a little guided workbook.
Say the name again. Living with what?
What's the third one?
Living in the Goodness of God. And that's by Rick Warren. I did like a $10 donation and got it. So it was his thing. But
He also takes the valleys and defines them, like the Valley of Elah.
Oh,
He said that's depression and what you go through, and he parallels it with what you go through in life.
I started watching. I didn't get it finished this week, but I started watching an archaeology series on David on the United. It's called on the United Kingdom, because part of what you get is some people will say there was no David. He's a legendary figure, and basically what they do is they say he's like King Arthur. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the legend.
He's a legend.
Michelangelo started.
Yeah.
I know.
But there's this video series that's on Logos that basically goes and does the archaeology part of the United Kingdom. And he goes through the valleys. They fly over the valleys and show you all these valleys. And there's so many sort of deep meanings between them all. Yeah. Because it takes you to the valley of Elhorn or whatever it is that the David and Goliath battle happened, and you see it all. You see the brook, you see the valley, you see the two mountains. I mean, this is real. So, pretty cool stuff.
Good job.
All right. I was only 7 minutes late. Sorry.
Why did we do 2 tonight?
We're
Part of the reading though was about
we're
this.
trying to
Holy Spirit.
crunch
Crunch it along.
crunch it all in.